Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 95, The Battle of Cape St. Vincent. Before I begin, I'd like to remind all of our wonderful listeners that if you'd like to support this podcast, please go to patreon.com/generalsandnapoleon. There you'll find many options to support our podcast, and as always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have one of my finest guests I've ever had on, back on the show, Mr. Evan Wilson from the U.S. Naval War College. How are you, Evan?
Good, John. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. For those of you not familiar with Evan, he is a professor at the War College, and he has several books on British naval history. And before we dive into today's topic, which is the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, Evan has a lovely disclaimer he'd like to share with you all.
The views and opinions I express today are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. government or the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Naval War College, none of whom usually have strong opinions about the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, but nevertheless, let's just cover that base just in case.
All right, we got that out of the way. Good deal. Okay, for those of you who aren't familiar, and probably most of you are not, we're going to dive into the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, 1797, which occurred off the tip of Portugal, the southern tip of Portugal. Why is this a significant battle? Why are we talking about this one, Evan?
So 3 reasons. The first is the one that your listeners will be most interested in, given the slant of this podcast and what we talked about last time. This is the great turning point in Nelson's career. Before this, he's an above average, but otherwise basically average naval officer. After this, he's famous. This is the battle that makes his name. This is the battle when the myths start to take hold. So if he had died the day before this battle, most of what had happened before that in his career, I think people would have said, yeah, he knew what he was doing. He was a competent naval officer. It's a shame he died. He might have been great. After this battle, everything about his early life gets turned into myths. Everything about what happens after this gets turned into myths. He starts to buy into his own myths. This is the turning point in his career. So that's number one. Number two, it's a major blow to the Spanish Navy. So why does that matter? Well, the Spanish Navy takes a long time to recover from this battle. It doesn't kill it entirely. The Spanish Navy very famously is a major participant at Trafalgar 8 years later. But the Spanish Navy is what kept the Spanish Empire together, right? The collapse of Spanish naval power, which you can really start to see accelerate from this battle in 1797, means that the bonds of the Spanish Empire start to fray, and that in turn encourages Central and South American colonies to reevaluate their relationship to Spain. So the independence of half of the world, and if you want to look at it that way, you can start to see hinging on this battle. Not to say that this battle causes those things, but rather just to say, if you give the Spanish Navy a body blow, as the British do here, there are some long-term consequences of that I think we can see in retrospect. They weren't obvious at the time, but they were certainly something that we can now see 200 years later.
Okay.
Third reason, it's the first piece of good news for Britain in a long time. So it really decreased the likelihood that the French and Spanish could launch an invasion of Britain. Now, a week after the battle, the French actually put about 1,000 men in Wales, in one of the few successful landings in the British Isles in these wars. So the threat was real. I mean, there were plans to put troops ashore, but it didn't end up working out for a variety of reasons. This battle helps prevent that from happening. Like many naval battles in British naval history, you can connect it to an invasion threat. If you deal the Spanish Navy a body blow, like I said, they're less likely to be able to support an invasion of the British Isles.
Okay. Well, I think that's certainly a very important point. But the first two also, like for Nelson, this is kind of like his Austerlitz or Marengo, like his early Rivoli for Napoleon, like his early victory for him that really puts him on the map.
And also remember that if you want to think about the geopolitics of this battle, Napoleon's own rise is very closely connected to this battle. In fact, now, he has nothing to do with this one, but you can sort of follow a chain of causality here to it. So in 1796, that's Napoleon's great year. That's the year that he makes his name in Italy.
Mhm.
He'd obviously done a lot at Toulon back in 1793, but 96 is the year when he's clearly elevated to another level. And that is actually one of the sort of long-term causes of why this battle happened where it happened, which is that by overrunning Italy, which he does over the course of 1796, he makes the British position in the Mediterranean very uncertain. They probably could have stayed in the Mediterranean. They had established what was called the Anglo-Corsican Kingdom in Napoleon's own homeland, which was this bizarre sort of early attempt at a Commonwealth kind of state that was run by the British under a viceroy. But if you overrun Italy, then Corsica is suddenly maybe as certain a position as you would want it to be. And so Napoleon's successful campaigns in 1796 cause the British to have to rethink the Anglo-Corsican Kingdom, as well as some revolts on the island against British rule. So that's happening on one level. Then the other thing that happens in 1796 is that Spain switches sides. So Spain had been a British ally for the first 3 or 4 years of the war, and at the end of 1796, the Spanish decide, under a very Francophile minister, to switch and become French allies. Okay. And if the British no longer have Spain as an ally on the western half of the Mediterranean, and Napoleon has overrun the northern part of Italy, they can't support a fleet in the Mediterranean anymore. There are very few allies for them to support anyways, and there's nowhere for them to put their fleet. So they have to evacuate the Mediterranean in November, December, January of 1796, 1797. And that means that the British fleet, actually, the British Mediterranean fleet, ends up being stationed in Lisbon, which is famously not in the Mediterranean.
Right.
But that's why this battle, which involves the British Mediterranean fleet, actually takes place outside the Mediterranean and takes place off the coast of Spain and Portugal.
Can we also talk about your second point that you started with, the Spanish Navy? I mean, we're not far away from the glory days of the Spanish Armada, which was the most powerful force for many years. So it's still a force to be reckoned with. It's not as mighty as it once was, but it's still a good Navy, correct?
Yeah. Probably the most underrated Navy of the period in the 18th century. It's not to say it was brilliant. It had its problems, but it had certain advantages that other navies of the time didn't. A lot of that had to do with overseas shipbuilding capacity. So a lot of these Spanish ships, they famously built the most durable, most defensible ships in the world in the 1790s out of these tropical hardwoods in places like Havana, that made them the envy of the world, really. Because, remember, the Spanish Navy was built to police and to stitch together a global empire stretching from the Philippines to all the way back around to Spain again, right through South America. And so they wanted ships that were durable. They wanted ships that could stay at sea for a long time. And then they had to actually spend the money to keep the Navy operational. So, no, they know what they're doing, sort of. There's some issues with the quality of the Spanish Navy here at this particular battle, but they're a formidable opponent, and they sort of get lost in the shuffle, I think, when we talk about navies of this period. But no, it's a real fighting force with some probably the largest ship in the world is in the Spanish Navy and is at this battle, the Santísima Trinidad. Depends on how you measure the size of the ship, but she is plausibly has a claim to be the largest ship in the world, and she's the flagship of the Spanish admiral at this battle.
Okay. So the battle takes place February 14th, 1797. We're going to get into the numbers and all that here in a minute and how the battle starts. But let's talk about the commanders on both sides, because although Nelson is involved, he isn't in overall command. What can you tell us about Admiral Sir John Jervis, the British commander?
So I'm writing a biography of him right now, so I can tell you way more than you ever would want to know about him. But I'll try to...
Top line overview, yeah.
Gotcha. The first thing to say about him is I'm pretty sure, and there's no way you would know this, but I'm pretty sure that his name was often pronounced Jarvis at the time, like as if it had an A. In fact, sometimes it was spelled that way. It's hard to figure out how things are pronounced in the 18th century because there are recordings of what they said, but we think it might have been Jarvis. So Jarvis, most important thing to remember about him that people don't usually know about him is that he's old. That's a strange thing to say, but he was born in 1735. So he is more than 20 years older than Nelson. And that's, they're in basically different generations and different sort of generations of naval officers. So If you think about him in that older generation, I think that can help sort of contextualize him in relationship to Nelson. He's very much older than Nelson and very much his senior. He joined the Navy in 1748. So by the time he's fighting this battle in 1797, he's been in the British Navy for almost 50 years, right? So he's been around the block. He's seen everything. The key quote to sort of summarize him in one sentence comes from the Earl of Sandwich, the First Lord of the Admiralty. He's a clever guy, and he summarized Jarvis in one sentence, which is that he was, quote, a good officer, but turbulent and busy and violent as a politician.
Oh.
So that's the kind of one-sentence summary of Jarvis. He's a good officer. He knows what he's doing. He's famous for his tight discipline and seamanship and for his ability to identify talented subordinates. So he's not somebody that you would want to cross. Turbulent and busy. By that I mean everything around Jarvis was constantly in a state of churn. Nothing about him was ever, smooth. Say it was either with somebody or he was at paper war with somebody. He was constantly antagonizing people, often for good reason, but not always.
Right.
And the violent as a politician part just means that when Jarvis decided that he liked you, man, there's nothing better than that in the British Navy of the period. If you're on Team Jarvis, you have a great ally. If Jarvis decided he did not like you, however, look out, because he would pull no punches to ruin your career and to do whatever he thought was best. He loved Nelson. And so one of the connections here is that he identified Nelson as someone who was talented. They had a lot of similar tactical ideas. They're very different people, but they had a lot of similar tactical ideas, and they worked really well together, and he put Nelson in a position to succeed.
All right. Regarding the Spanish commanders, who was the primary guy?
So Jose de Cordoba y Ramos, I'm sorry for that pronunciation, but Cordoba, as he's usually known, was even older than Jarvis, actually. He was born in 1732, so vastly experienced. The guy had been around a long time. He's known as a really good sailor, so he himself knew what he was doing at sea. And he was famous for being able to keep his ships healthy on those really long trans-Pacific voyages that the Spanish Navy had to make. So not an idiot, someone who knew what he was doing. The problem with Cordoba is more the fleet that he's commanding, as we'll get to, and the intelligence that he has about what he's trying to do.
Okay. Let's compare the numbers. This is always tricky for me. It looks to me that it's 15 ships of the line for the British and 25 ships of the line for the Spanish, along with supporting frigates and ships for both.
See, when you started this, you thought, well, this will be an easy question. I'll answer it quickly and we'll move right on. This is not an easy question for a couple reasons. And I promise we will get to easier questions later. This is not one, however. Right. So it's complicated and it's important to understand the balance of forces. But more importantly, it's complicated to understand and important to understand the perception of the balance of forces on both sides. Because remember, they can't tell exactly how many ships the other side has, and that's one of the weirdest parts about this battle. So let me walk you through it. The British had 15 ships of the line. You're absolutely right about that. There's no question about how many ships of the line the British had. But 5 of them had just arrived on February 6th, so 8 days before the battle, from the Channel Fleet. Why does that matter? Well, the Spanish didn't know that these ships had arrived. So the Spanish thought, when they thought about Jarvis's fleet, that he had 10 ships of the line, and in fact he had 15. So that's an important oopsie. You're actually 50% larger than you were before. Third, right? Don't do math in public, but you get the idea. Like substantially more powerful than they were a week before because they got this reinforcement. Right. On the Spanish side, there were a total of 27 ships that the British thought they might have to fight. So that when the British counted the ships in front of them as they come through the haze, we'll talk about the weather on the day, but as they look at the ships in front of them, they're like, there are 27 ships of the line out there, and we've only got 15. So the British think they're outnumbered almost 2-1. That wasn't actually true either. In fact, there are probably 22 Spanish ships of the line. The one of them is a 64, which is a pretty small ship of the line for this period. 22 ships of the line that are Spanish and 15 British. So that's the actual numbers as they match up. What are the other Spanish ships? So the other Spanish ships are the Mercury ships, which we need to talk about.
Mercury ships. What exactly are those? I'm not familiar with those.
So to make the Spanish Empire work the way the Spanish wanted it to work, they mined silver in South America, and then they turned that silver into coins, and that funded a large percentage of the Spanish government. In order to turn silver from the ground into coins, you need a lot of mercury. So these 4 ships were leaving Spain laden with mercury, couldn't pay me enough to be on that ship, to be clear, but laden with mercury, and they were going to go to South America to help get the mines rolling so that they could mint the coins and bring the coins back. So these 4 ships were the ships being escorted by this enormous Spanish fleet of 22 ships of the line. And remember, the Spanish thought that there were only 10 British ships, and they thought that they were off Lisbon. They didn't know where they were. So the Spanish thought, well, there are only 10 British ships, and they're far away. We'll be safe. We'll send Cordoba with most of his fleet out to guard these 4 Mercury ships, because we desperately need them to get safely to South America. And in fact, the British were stronger than they thought, and they weren't where they were expected to be. So they were, in fact, right off of Cape St. Vincent waiting for them, and had good intel about where the Spanish were going.
Okay. And then, frigates and smaller ships, I know they play an important part.
If the British had known exactly what the balance of forces were, which was actually 22 to 15 in terms of ships of the line, they still would have gone ahead with the action. And I know that because they thought they were 27 and they still went ahead with it. And that's because they'd recently been Spain's allies. So they had a pretty good sense of what the Spanish Navy was capable of. And they were not particularly impressed with the Spanish Navy and thought, I don't care how many ships of the line they actually have, we can take them.
And how many cannons roughly are on these ships of the line? I know there's different sizes of them.
So there are, in this battle, 4 different sizes of ships of the line that matter. The most common one, and the ship that Nelson's on, is a 74. That's called a third rate, and it's the standard ship of the line in the period. They're big. They've got 2 large gun decks, and they carry 74 guns, more or less. It's never quite exactly right. But just remember to compare this for your Army listeners. The broadside weight that these ships of the line are capable of throwing dwarfs anything that Napoleon can bring to any kind of land battle.
Yeah.
Ships are floating batteries. That doesn't mean they're better. It doesn't mean they're more special or whatever. It's just like these are the amount of metal that they can throw at, greater than the speed of sound is enormous. So a 32-pound cannon, there are, something like 30 plus 32-pound cannon on the gun decks of just the third-rate ships of the line. Contrast that with, what's the heaviest cannon? Not the howitzers, but the actual cannon that Napoleon's got in his army. Is it 12-pounder or something like that?
Yeah.
Right, so 32-pound cannon, that's common on these ships. And there are, at this battle, 37 ships of the line firing at each other? So back to the different sizes. The most common are these third rates. There is one fourth rate in the Spanish fleet, which is this 64. That's basically an out-of-date ship that doesn't belong in the line of battle anymore, but there's just one of those.
Right.
Then there are a few second rates. Second rates are usually like 90 guns or so. And what's crazy about this battle is the number of first rates. Both sides have a lot of first-rate ships of the line, which means over 100 guns. And as I mentioned, the Spanish have probably the largest ship in the world, the Santissima Trinidad, which in various configurations over her life sometimes carried as many as 130 guns. I think in the configuration that you see at this battle, she's got about 120, but it depends on how you're counting guns and that sort of thing. But the point is, they have the largest ships in the world are at this battle, and there are a lot of big 3-decker, and the Santissima Trinidad actually had 4 decks of guns carrying up to 120 guns. So it's not quite double the size of a 74, but she's beefy.
It's a lot of firepower. Yeah.
A lot of firepower that's being deployed here.
Okay. So let's jump into the battle. It begins early morning, February 14, 1797, and Jarvis tells his British officers, quote, "A victory to England is very essential at this moment," end quote. What was the state of the British Navy at this time, and weren't they the dominant force that we all know? Or why was this, was he just talking, proverbially, like, oh, it's very important, go forth and do, but did he mean that? Like, we need to win this.
He meant it, but not necessarily entirely for naval reasons. It was more for geopolitical reasons. So the threat of invasion back at home, the fact that they've been kicked out of the Mediterranean, the fact that the war of what we now call the War of the First Coalition was ending in catastrophe. The British lose what we now know as the War of the First Coalition badly, right? This battle, which happens near the end of the War of the First Coalition, does not save them from losing the war. So that's the state of Britain, and that's, I think, what Jarvis is really referring to. But the British Navy's in pretty good shape. What they don't know is that a couple months after the Battle of Cape St. Vincent is one of the most probably the low point for the British Navy in the entire Napoleonic Wars, which is when the Channel Fleet mutinies in the Great Mutinies of the summer of 1797. There are some signs of that already in Jarvis's fleet. They can see that there's some lower deck discontent here that might get bad, but they don't know this in February, and Jarvis doesn't know that when he says it. But we now know that they're right on the edge of nearly catastrophe.
Okay. Well, on the Spanish side, I've read that they were somewhat unprepared, or maybe it was foggy and they weren't ready, but they're formed up in two loose columns, the Spanish vessels are. So what happens at the beginning of the battle? What were they taken by surprise? What happens there?
It's a really hard battle to describe over a podcast. It's a hard battle to draw, even, because it's actually pretty complicated. And unfortunately for this battle, the complexity of which ship goes where when matters a lot. So the British know that the Spanish are there. The Spanish don't know that the British are there. Nelson had actually sailed through the Spanish fleet the night before the battle. He was coming back from Elba in a frigate where he just evacuated the last of the British forces out of the Mediterranean. He went right through the Spanish fleet in the middle of the night. He was like, oh, there's a Spanish fleet here. And he showed up and went to Jarvis and said, the Spanish fleet is right there. So they know that the Spanish fleet is there. The Spanish don't really know where Jarvis is. They're nervous, but they're not sure. The weather is hazy. Hazy is a hard thing to sort of envision today because most people don't spend a lot of time at sea, right? The breeze is variable, so it's a weird day. It's pretty flat. There's not a lot of waves. It's a sort of, you can imagine sort of mists in which you could maybe make something out, but not really. It's not that it's cloudy necessarily, but it's sort of hazy on the horizon. And the ship's logs, if you read them, record the wind coming from all sorts of different directions. It's basically coming from the southwest, but it's hard to be precise there. The result is that the fleets actually spot each other a couple hours after sunrise, and neither side is sure how big the other one is. Because remember, the Spanish think the British are weaker, and the British know that the Spanish are big, but they're not sure quite how big. So the ships sort of pop in and out of the haze, and they start to count them, and they're trying to figure out, all right, how many are we actually doing here? But remember, British intelligence about the Spanish is better than Spanish intelligence about the British. So even when Jarvis knows that he's heavily outnumbered, he's confident that his fleet is in better shape. And he's going to take them on if it's 15 to 27, even in how many ships of the line they have. So the Spanish are surprised by the British coming through here, which means that they have to try to get themselves organized on the fly, which is really difficult. To get a fleet organized requires everybody to know exactly where their ship needs to go. And remember, as we saw with the Dolly in Baltimore Harbor, right? Ships don't stop on dimes, and you can't put these things in reverse and say like, oh, hang on, let's just think about what we're trying to do here, right? So it takes a long time for ships to maneuver themselves into the right position. So the Spanish actually end up in, two loose groups, or you might say three groups on one side and one smaller group on another is another way to think about it, just in terms of the balance of forces. There are three groups roughly organized around the flagship to one side, and then there's one smaller group to leeward that's on the other side. Cordoba is like frantically signaling, saying, you go here, get in line, and it's a mess. So the Spanish are disorganized. The British form a line right away, and actually it's tight and efficient and everything that Jarvis could want. So they're more disciplined, and they've got a plan. And Jarvis sees the gap open up between the one side of the Spanish ships over here and the smaller group over there, and he sends his lead ship under Thomas Trowbridge straight through the middle. So he says, go in between them. And the idea was basically to divide the Spanish, because the British are outnumbered, they figure, let's divide the Spanish fleet in two, and we'll be able to defeat one side in detail, right?
Very Napoleon-esque.
Exactly. It's basic tactics. It's nothing radical. And the other thing about successful naval tactics is usually the simpler the better, for all the reasons I just mentioned about how hard it is to maneuver these ships. It depends on where the wind is blowing, and what if the wind changes. That's not something Napoleon usually has to think a whole lot about. The wind changes, now I can't go the direction I wanted to go, right? And then the other problem, something that Napoleon does have to think about a lot, is smoke, right? As soon as the firing starts, and the firing starts at just after 11 o'clock, the entire battlefield is shrouded in smoke, and it was hazy to begin with. So trying to figure out who's where and who's going where and how do you get there is really hard. So Jarvis has a simple plan: get in between them and roll them up. That's fair enough, right? So Jarvis sends his lead ship there, and he's headed for the in between the two Spanish groups, and everything looks like it's going well. But of course, the enemy gets a vote, and the Spanish, as they saw this happening, the larger Spanish ships turn to the north. And as they turn to the north, turn away from the wind to the north, he realizes he has to have the lead ship tack turn into the wind to go follow the lead Spanish group. What you need to picture basically is two snakes, okay? Two snakes that start to chase each other's tails.
All right.
So it's two lines-ish. The Spanish aren't really in a line, but that doesn't really matter. But they're trying to chase each other's tails, which means that if the Spanish fleet that's turned north manages to turn all the way back around and meet up with the smaller Spanish group, they might be able to organize themselves into defense and solve that problem of having had that gap in their lines. And maybe the British won't be able to get a decisive result out of this battle. So those are the opening maneuvers. The British go in between the two Spanish groups. The Spanish turn, the British follow, and now we're at the pivotal point in the battle. This is the moment that we've all been waiting for.
Okay. So Nelson, as I mentioned before, he's not in command, but he is aboard a ship that he is commanding called the Captain. How does he perform in the battle?
Yeah. So he's a Commodore, senior post captain, who's flying a pennant on board the Captain. There's actually a captain of the Captain. Man, that's a terrible name for a ship. But anyways, Nelson is basically in control of that ship, so he has some authority to tell it what to do. At this pivotal moment, when the British are chasing the larger Spanish fleet, and it looks like the Spanish might be able to link back up with each other, Jarvis and Nelson separately come to the same conclusion, which is that the Spanish, if they do link up, that's bad. We need to stop that from happening. What needs to happen is that the back of the British line, the back of the British snake, needs to turn around and get to the front of the Spanish snake, right? To basically divide the British snake in half, turn the back around to meet the head so that it doesn't meet up with its other part. I don't know if that's making any sense, but that's...
I got you. I'm with you. Yep.
Jarvis orders Vice Admiral Charles Thompson, who is in command of the rear division, wear out of line, to basically turn away from the wind, out of line, to go intercept the Spanish lead group, which is turning back to meet its other part, right? Thompson misses the signal. He can't see it. He was busy trying to fix part of his ship that had been broken, and the weather's really hazy and the smoke is bad, and he doesn't see the signal. Nelson didn't see the signal either, but he did what Jarvis ordered him to do. In other words, we can't credit Nelson didn't disobey orders, but nor did he follow orders that he saw because he never saw the orders. But it turned out that Jarvis was basically giving him the order anyways. So it's not a disobeying of orders thing. It's Jarvis and Nelson being on the same tactical page. Nelson wore out a line. He turned his ship away from the wind, and it went back around all the way around in a almost, 3/4 of the way around a circle. And he headed straight for the largest Spanish ship, the Santísima Trinidad, the flagship. There with a 74-gun ship. That's not the ship you'd pick if you were going to pick any. He went for a ship that is nearly twice the size of his. And he said, I'm going for it anyways. And the 3 ships behind Nelson in line saw what he did and were like, that's what we need to do. And they follow Nelson to turn that back half of the British line around. So by following Nelson there, the British get 4 ships to head off the Spanish as they're turning around. And in doing that, they basically save the battle from being either a draw or, the British being unable to bring this into a decisive result.
Okay. Now, this next part, it seems like it's part of the Nelson legend, and it makes me realize how close these ships got to each other. It seems he used one enemy ship to cross to another ship, which is, if it sounds like to me, he ran across the deck with, you'll have to explain it to me, but he ran across the deck to capture another ship. Yeah. But I don't know if that's accurate. It seems wild to me.
Pretty accurate, actually. It's famously called Nelson's Patent Bridge for Boarding First Rates. And the Patent Bridge is another first rate. So that's the joke. But I'll explain that here in a second. So Captain comes out of line, goes straight to the Santísima Trinidad, and suddenly is engaged with 5 or 6 Spanish ships simultaneously. Then the other British ships come up to support Nelson and Captain. And eventually the battle turns into a melee. So it turns into chaos, right? And there's just ships everywhere, smoke everywhere. It's really hard to tell who's doing what. And that matters because Captain ends up specifically engaged with the San Jose, which is one of a more regularly sized Spanish ship. It's not as big as Santísima Trinidad. San Jose and Captain damage each other so much that they both lose steering. San Jose, in the part where it can't steer, runs into the San Nicolas, another Spanish ship. And so now you've got two Spanish ships entangled with each other. They're actually, touching each other, and they can't get themselves disentangled. And you've got Captain coming up alongside San Jose. So as that's happening, Nelson sees that the windows of the stern gallery, the back part of the Spanish ship San Jose, have been blown out, and he leads a boarding party through the windows of the back of the stern of the San Jose while other people come in the bow, and they take the San Jose in a very bloody fight. That's when most of Captain's casualties happen, right then, when they actually go board the San Jose.
Yeah.
So that's a big bloody fight. But remember, the San Nicolas has been attached by accident to the San Jose at this point. Collingwood, one of Nelson's great lieutenants, he's his second in command of Trafalgar 8 years later. Collingwood is in the captain of the Excellent, and the Excellent was right behind Nelson in line and had followed Nelson out of line to come to captain's support. And Excellent just obliterates the San Nicolas, just parks offside and just brutally slaughters the sailors on board the San Nicolas, which means that when Nelson has taken the San Jose, he looks across to see that the San Nicolas is right there and is like, well, here we go, boys. And he goes over to the San Nicolas, and the San Nicolas basically doesn't put up a fight. So there's a famous scene in which the officers on the San Nicolas, there's blood everywhere, the decks are bloody, it's just awful scenes. They surrender their ship to him by just basically handing over their swords. And one of Nelson's longtime sailors who've been with him for a long time takes the swords and sort of puts them under his arm very casually, and they've taken two Spanish ships. So was it just Nelson? Not really. He had a lot of help. A lot of different ships fired into these two Spanish ships. But he did lead, as a flag officer, he led a boarding party onto one Spanish ship and then took another one, which was unheard of, basically.
Yeah, that's a wild story. But yeah, no, that adds to the legend for sure. You mentioned the battle started at 11. By 4 p.m., the British kind of have things in hand. How did it end, and what were the casualties on each side?
So the British take 4 Spanish ships out of the 22, which at the time was quite a remarkable percentage. Remember that the line of battle is designed as a defensive tactic, and most naval battles, if you didn't screw up, would end in a draw because it was hard to actually get through to break the lines and to cause a melee. So it was pretty rare for naval battles to have, massive swings in terms of number of ships captured or sunk or whatever. So 4 was a pretty big number. It turns out later in Nelson's career, he figures out ways to do way more than that and do way better than that. But in 1797, it's a big deal. So that's the first thing. 4 Spanish ships. 3,000 Spanish prisoners of war from those ships. Because remember, each one of these ships has like 700, 800 men on it. So you capture a Spanish ship, you get a lot of men. The Spanish have about 280 killed and 334 wounded. The Santissima Trinidad, the big ship that I mentioned, the flagship at the beginning, somehow managed to escape, didn't get captured. But on the Santissima Trinidad alone, she had about 300 casualties. So that's like more than a third, almost a half of her crew, maybe a third of her crew, I guess, were either killed or wounded. That's about equivalent to the total number of casualties in the British fleet, which were about 300, some killed, some wounded. So it was very bloody on the Spanish side, less bloody on the British side, but 4 ships and 3,000 prisoners.
Okay, so it's a victory for the British. What was kind of the aftermath of the battle?
I want to get the strategic stuff out of the way first, because the Nelson stuff is more interesting and it's got a lot more color to it. So the strategic stuff is basically that after the battle, the British blockaded the rest of the Spanish Navy in Cadiz. Now, they lost the War of the First Coalition anyways, and Spain remained a French ally, but the British were basically able to take the Spanish Navy, off the board for a few years thanks to this battle. So that's not nothing. Naval battles are rarely decisive in terms of the outcome of a war. As you know, you actually have to go win wars on land, but this was a big deal. So that strategically, this did matter. It didn't quite yet get the British back into the Mediterranean, but by 1798, they're back in the Mediterranean when Nelson goes off to win the Battle of the Nile. That battle happens when Nelson is detached from Jarvis's squadron blockading Cadiz. So they're still there in the summer of 1798, blockading the Spanish Navy in Cadiz. So that's the strategic outcome of the battle. And I mentioned the bigger picture about the Spanish Navy suffering a pretty bad body blow. It's not the thing that eventually puts the nail in the coffin, which is Trafalgar, but we can see where this is headed in that direction. Nelson was nervous that he disobeyed orders. Because remember, when he pulled out a line, he didn't actually see the signal that told him to pull out a line. So he was like, oh, crap. Like, I wonder if he's pissed.
Yeah.
So right after the battle, his ship, the captain, is in really bad shape. It's damaged. He leaves the captain, leaves the San Jose, leaves the San Nicolas, and gets on a frigate and goes straight to Victory, which is Jarvis's flagship, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically like, I'm sorry, boss. I hope, are we good? Right? And so Jarvis is like, are you kidding me? Fantastic job. I'm so happy, and they embraced. And the point was that Jarvis and Nelson had the same idea. Even if they hadn't been able to communicate it, Jarvis was thrilled that Nelson had taken that initiative and had understood what he wanted done. And so he was really pleased with that. So it's really a testament to both men that Jarvis had managed to train his fleet to have that kind of tactical and tactical flexibility, and the trust between Jarvis and Nelson was there to be able to say, yes, it's okay to do that if you see that opportunity. So that's what Nelson was just checking on, to be like, are we good? We're good. Okay.
Well, yeah, like you explained at the beginning, this Jarvis guy is somewhat of a hurricane, a drama guy. So maybe it'd be like explaining to Darth Vader that you did something wrong. You don't know how he's going to react.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that you did the right thing. So Nelson quickly is like, did I do the right thing, boss? Jarvis is like, you did the right thing. Great job.
Yeah.
Because everybody's happy. So Nelson was brave enough to take his own initiative. That's one of his great gifts. And the other great gift that he had was that he was able to see in a rapidly changing tactical situation like this what needed to be done. And Nelson shows us over and over again at battles throughout his career that he's capable of understanding what's very hard for other people to understand in smoke, in changing, in the noise, and like the ships are moving and which ship is which and all that stuff. Like Nelson gets that and he sees through all that and is like, this is what needs to happen, and he did it. And that's a testament both to Jarvis and to Nelson.
Okay.
Then the famous part of the aftermath of the battle, I'm sorry to just keep going.
No, go ahead.
Just like Nelson. So I'm going to unpack this in the biography, because Nelson writes his own set of dispatches home, which is not cool. You don't do that. The admiral who's in command writes the dispatches to say, this is what happened, and this is who did a good job, and this is who did a bad job. That's the point of the dispatch, to say, aren't we great? Right? Nelson wrote his own dispatches home, which were unofficial, but like, you got to be really careful how you thread that needle if you're Nelson. It wasn't his idea. It was Gilbert Elliot's idea. Gilbert Elliot was a guy who'd been in charge at Corsica back in the Mediterranean, and he and Nelson had some good exchanges. So Elliot told Nelson to give one of the Spanish admiral's swords, remember the swords that the sailor put under his arm, right? To give one of the Spanish admiral's swords as a gift to the city of Norwich in Norfolk. And remember, Nelson's from Norfolk. Because the thing is, if you give this gift to Norwich, you provide cover for a lieutenant to go back to London with the sword as the gift for the city of Norwich, right? With a letter saying, this is what happened. And so the lieutenant went back on the first frigate home, went straight to London with the letter, and handed it to one of Elliot's political allies in London, who then made sure that the First Order of the Admiralty, the king was actually the first one to see it, the king, the First Order of the Admiralty, and the newspapers all got copies of Nelson's dispatch, not Jarvis's. Jarvis's dispatch, there was a public one and a private one. The public one ended up in the Gazette, which is the newspaper that would publish that sort of thing. But he played it very straight. He was just like, everybody did a great job. Lucky us. In the private dispatch, he was like, some people did a better job than others, but that was a private dispatch, right? That was for the First Lord to understand what had actually happened. Nelson wrote his own story about what had happened at the battle. And guess who the hero of Nelson's story was? Flabbergasted to learn that it was, in fact, Nelson had won the day. I can't believe it. How did that happen, right? And then so then when the West End in London starts to put on shows about what had happened at the battle, guess who everybody hails as the great conquering hero of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent? Nelson. Guess who reads Nelson's dispatches in the newspaper? Everybody. So Nelson becomes the great hero of the battle, thanks in part to getting his own dispatches back first.
You have to be careful of that kind of thing, though. Because I remember Marshal Bernadotte did that after Wagram, where he actually performed terribly. And Napoleon was not very happy with his dispatches. So you have to, yes, Nelson did well, but you have to not supersede your boss.
Indeed. And there were other officers in the Navy who were like, wait a minute, I actually did more at this battle than Nelson said I did. Nelson's version of the battle is that the captain pulled out a line, went right to the Spanish ships, right? And was fighting them all off for like hours before anybody else showed up to help. And all the other captains in the fleet were like, I was right there. Like, what are you doing, man? I was right behind you the whole time, right? So there's a lot of that going on. So he pisses off some people. William Parker, who's the flag officer who brought those 5 reinforcements down to the Channel from the Channel Fleet right before the battle. He's one of the ones who Nelson really shortchanges, and he's pissed at Nelson for years afterwards because he didn't get the credit he deserved, which is totally.
I get it. Yeah. Well, on the other side, why do you think the Spanish had such a poor showing at that battle?
I think, first of all, it's an intelligence failure. If they'd known that the British fleet was as powerful as it was and where it was, I mean, maybe the Mercury ships were important enough to run the risk anyways, but that was quite a risk, and that's a real intelligence failure. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that British seamanship and gunnery throughout the battle are superior to Spanish seamanship and gunnery. So the initial maneuvers to get in line and to figure out where they're going, the British do better. The British aren't perfect. We should always remember, when we think about naval battles, that what you draw on a piece of paper in a book that shows how the ships maneuvered and what actually happened are rarely that precise. Sailing ships in variable winds do not have precision, is not what they're doing, right? So the British line isn't perfect, and the British have some issues when they tack, but the issues are all manageable and they're expected, and they're something that they're able to overcome. The Spanish are in these loose groups that can't provide mutual support, and it's a real shame. The gunnery problem is the other one. Jarvis was one of those British naval officers who really emphasized gunnery practice, and so his ships tended to fire faster and more accurately than the Spanish ships. And so in a melee, that overcame the Spanish numerical advantage, because if one British ship could fire, say, 1.5 times the rate of a Spanish ship, it eliminated that numerical discrepancy.
Okay. Well, my last question for you, and we have a lot to draw from here. We have Trafalgar, we have the Battle of the Nile, we have a few others. Is this Nelson's best performance?
The other ones you mentioned, he's in a slightly different position in the hierarchy. So at the Nile, he's in command. At Trafalgar, he's in command. At Copenhagen, he's the second in command. And actually, this battle looks a lot like Copenhagen for reasons that I'll explain in a second. But absolutely, St. Vincent is in his pantheon, no doubt about it. This is as good as any of his performances. He showed the kind of tactical awareness and physical bravery that made his name. And then he also showed afterwards how interested he was in making sure everyone else knew how brilliant he was. That was Nelson in a nutshell, right? So St. Vincent, it's got everything about Nelson that you'd ever want. And it's the key delineating point in his career where before he's a good officer, after he's something else. He's a celebrity, he's a myth, he's something like that. The reason I bring up Copenhagen is that both of those battles involved Nelson not in command, having to deal with a superior who is trying to manage a battle from a distance in smoke and haze and difficult circumstances. And
1801 Copenhagen.
1801, not 1807. He's dead by then.
Yeah.
But 1801, Nelson is in the sort of advanced division that's doing most of the fighting. Hyde Parker behind him thinks that Nelson's in trouble and gives Nelson an order that would allow him, if he wanted, to basically withdraw. To say, if things are going poorly, it looks like things are going poorly from where I'm sitting. If you need to get out, get out. And Nelson, this is where he famously puts the telescope up to his blind eye and says to his flag captain, I have a right to be blind sometimes, and he ignores the order. There's a similar kind of thing happening here where Jarvis and Nelson don't actually communicate the way you'd want them to if they had access to radios, right? Like you just say, Nelson, turn, right? Okay, great. That can't happen. So you need to be on the same page as your commanding officer. At St. Vincent, they are. At Copenhagen, they're not. But in both cases, Nelson recognizes what the commanding officer is trying to accomplish and sees that he has access to better information in front of him and acts decisively and does so very effectively. So that's where Nelson, I think, really has himself from some of his contemporaries who, that's a really difficult skill to learn, is when the shots are flying, how do you actually peer through all that and say, this is what needs to happen?
Yeah. And even in Napoleon's army, there's very few. I can think maybe Massena, who had a clear mind when the smoke is going, the noise is going, and you can't hear or see anything, and you still have that clear mind to figure out what needs to be done. And it sounds like Nelson had that ability.
Absolutely. And St. Vincent is where he most definitively shows it, probably more than even at any other battle in his storied career. And it's what made his name. And, you know, for all the jokes about how he made sure that everybody knew that he had been the one who'd done this, that's a little unfair of me. I mean, he legitimately was the officer who made that decisive move out of the line and saved the day. So he deserves a lot of the credit for that. And I don't mean to disparage that part of his experience in this battle.
Just real quick, what happens to Jarvis after this? I know you said he was kind of aged by this point. Does he retire soon, or what happens?
You'd think so, but no. He goes on to probably the most important part of his career. Actually, comes after this, surprisingly. So he's in command of the Mediterranean through 1797 and 1798 and into 1799, and those years are the years of the Great Discipline Crisis in the Navy. And so Jarvis is perceived by the Admiralty in London as the place where you send troublesome ships. So they send him to Jarvis in the Mediterranean, and he basically hangs people until the ship is back into discipline. It's a really horrible story of him famously hanging people on a Sunday, right? So Jarvis is the disciplinarian of the Mediterranean fleet. Then he becomes commander of the Channel Fleet, which is the fleet tasked with blockading the French in Brest. And there again, he introduces this strict disciplinary regime, and he makes his captains get up on deck at all hours of the day, and he's on deck himself with a telescope to see if you're actually on deck the whole time. So he's a real hard charger and a disciplinarian. And you'd think, okay, well, maybe that's the end. Because after all, at this point, he's almost 70 years old. Like, time to hang him up, right? Nope. Then he becomes First Lord of the Admiralty, actually, in 1801. And so from 1801 to 1804, he's First Lord of the Admiralty, and he brings with him the same kind of like puritanical beliefs that he had when he was in charge of fleets. But when you're in charge of a fleet and there's a clear enemy right there, the bad guys, you're the good guys, go fight them, right? The discipline kind of makes sense. When you're in charge of the entire Navy and you identify the bad guys as, for example, the Navy Board, who's responsible for, you know, providing all the supplies for your ships and running the dockyards, and you think the Navy Board is horribly corrupt, bad things happen. So St. Vincent, he becomes the Earl of St. Vincent after the battle, I should mention. St. Vincent dramatically reduces British fleet readiness right on the peace between 1801 and 1803, the Peace of Amiens, right? And one way to think about it is that Nelson's victory at Trafalgar restores all the damage. It repairs all the damage that St. Vincent had done as First Lord. So it's not it's a wildly unsuccessful period in charge as First Lord. And you'd think, time to hang him up, you're done, right? Nope. He comes back to the Channel Fleet in 1806 for a year. He's in charge of the Channel Fleet 1806 and 1807. And then he finally retires. And he lives 1823, dies age 88.
Wow.
As Admiral of the Fleet. St. Vincent's career is just, I mean, you'd think it would be 50 years in the Navy. We're almost at the end, right? No, he's still got the most important parts of his career the next decade after this.
Yeah, I didn't know a lot about Jarvis or his later title, St. Vincent. But yeah, no, that's quite a biography. I have to read up on this guy.
Apparently the king was the one who picked the name. Jarvis did not want to be the Earl of St. Vincent because it's a kind of a weird name to be named after a battle that's named after a cape that's named after a saint. Like, it's a weird thing. But the king was like, what battle did you win? Battle of Cape St. Vincent? Okay, that's your name. And that's how it became.
Well, I'll have to read your book on Jarvis when it comes out.
I'll be sure to let you know.
Yeah, indeed. Well, as always, we thank Evan for joining us. This is a fascinating episode on a battle I was not very familiar with, and learned a lot about Nelson and Jarvis. Yeah, I really appreciate it, my friend.
Thanks for having me.